I'm going to demonstrate 4 short watercolour tutorials based on different skies, and I'm going to share with you some of my top watercolour tips. Let's get started. So this is my first short tutorial based on a cloudy sky. So this sky is from my imagination, and I've sketched out a horizon line with some land. I've mixed up a puddle of cerulean and I'm wetting the paper with a large soft haired brush. And I'm just applying now some of the cerulean wet into wet. Each time you sort of go across, keep loading that brush. You want to try and keep everything the same consistency so you don't get any streaking in your painting. I've also got my painting on a slight tilt. I've used something to tilt it forward. It's about a 15-degree angle, maybe a touch more. And I'm just lightening the wash now, paling it towards the horizon, and then just putting a bit of same colour in the sea as well, just making it a stronger tone right at the bottom of the page. So you're creating depth in your painting. And now I'm just using a paper towel. You can use a tissue as well, and just sort of scrunch it up, keep it sort of random, and just sort of lift off the paint. It comes off really nicely. It's fun to do, especially as I say, you're a beginner. You can play around with this technique and actually make the clouds look like clouds just by lifting off with a tissue or kitchen towel there. And as you go towards the horizon, just make those clouds smaller. For my second tip is, if all goes wrong, you can actually wash off your sky under the tap and you can start again. Sometimes there will be some staining, so I'm going to kind of paint the same sky again because that cerulean slightly stained the paper. So I've washed it off under the tap, so the paper is wet. I've actually added a bit of ultramarine to that cerulean now to make it a bit darker at the top, and I'm just painting around those sort of cloud shapes that I lifted out before, and just going to pale that wash and make those clouds look a bit smaller as it goes towards the horizon there. I've even added a touch of pink into the ultramarine there, just to make it a little bit sort of darker at the top, really to create some depth. So it's a little bit more of a dramatic sky, but it just shows actually, if you do wash your painting off, you're a little bit braver, a little bit more confident, and as I feel now, the second time round, because you know you can wash it off, and you can wash it off again because the paper can take it. So I've made quite small, paler washes towards the horizon and just painted in the sea there as well. What I'm doing now is I'm just mixing up a little bit of the magenta, a touch of the ultramarine, and a tiny touch of burnt sienna. I'm wiping it off on my paper towel, and I'm just going to paint this shadow at the bottom part of the clouds damp into damp. That's why I took that excess off on the paper towel. I don't want to introduce wetter paint onto the sky, or else I'll get back runs. So I've just painted in them smaller marks towards the horizon, and now I've just rinsed my brush off so it's clean, and I'm just blending a little bit towards the top of the clouds, trying to leave the light at the top. So it's quite a nice way of painting these cloud shadows all at the same time really, and getting some quite nice effects. And remember, if you don't like what you've got there, just lift it off with the paper towel. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I'm just painting in some distant hills here, using a little bit of ultramarine, a touch of pink, very greyed down, very watered down. So this is the furthest. We work light to dark in watercolours, and in landscape or seascape paint I like to work back to front as well. So I'll paint the furthest thing first, let that dry so it's paler in tone, cooler in colour. I'm just dropping a little bit of paint here, sort of wet into wet, just to create a little bit of dark just at the bottom there. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Actually, I'm just going to put another layer on my imaginary painting here. It's just building up. Remember I said earlier about light to dark, so it's darker in tonal value here, and I'm just creating a little bit of texture and interest at the top of this as well, so it looks like, you know, bushes or trees in the distance here, and you get a nice hard edge because this is working wet on dry as well. So I'm using some ultramarine with a touch of pink and Payne's grey, and I'm using a dry brush technique. So I've taken off the excess paint on my paper towel, and I've painted quite swiftly, so you get that lovely texture of the watercolour paper, whether it be rough or cold press paper. And I've loaded my brush more there just to use a solid wash just at the bottom of the sea there. I'm using my size 2 brush here with a mixture of the Payne's grey and the ultramarine. I'm just putting a few darks and details to finish off this painting that I did from my imagination. I thought it'd be quite nice to add a few birds to this cloudy seascape scene here. And actually just adding a few birds to a painting like this really brings it to life. So I'm just using a bit of Payne's grey, maybe the touch of burnt sienna with this size 2 brush, just varying the size. So there's one larger bird, one smaller, and one in the distance as well. So that's the end of my first painting, the painting of the cloudy sky. So for my next sky, I'm going to paint a sunset, and this will be the first stage. So what I'm doing here now is I'm going to mix up some washes now for this sunset sky. I'm using Daler Rowney's Permanent Yellow, but you can just use a cadmium yellow. I'm using the Core Pyrrole Red, but you can use cadmium red. And I'm mixing the cadmium red with the yellow, a little bit more yellow here, just to make sure I've got plenty of wash for my sky. I don't want to be mixing colours while I'm painting. Well, I probably will do, but I would advise you, if you're starting out in watercolour, you want to be able to have your colours mixed before painting. So I've got more of a red orange and a yellowy orange, and yellow on its own at the top there, wetting the sky. And I've used masking fluid to mask out the sun, a really good tip to reserve the light and white of your paper. If you don't have masking fluid, you could actually paint around the sun, use wax resist, or use white paint at the end of your painting. So just giving the sky a good soak. Really do spend time wetting your sky. The longer you do this, the more time it gives you to paint, because the moisture goes into the membranes of the paper and it just keeps it wet for longer. I'm using my size 10 brush, and I'm just painting in, just looking at the photograph and just painting wet into wet, this sort of more the yellow sort of colours first, working light to dark. So the yellow is my lightest colour here, and I'm just really taking my time so I just get it in the right place. There's obviously a lot of blue sky here as well, so I'm not going to be painting that until the painting has dried. So I'm dropping in now the yellow orange colour. It's the yellow with a pinch of red, and just tickling this into the sky with the tip of my brush. You saw I wiped a little bit of excess on my water pot there. It's only because it was just too much paint on my brush. You may find it easier to wipe your brush on a paper towel as an alternative to this. Just adding a little bit more red now on its own. I'm just mixing this up now because I just saw a little bit more red in those clouds from the printed photograph, and I'm just painting this in wet as well, still using my size 10 brush, and I'm just sort of taking my time here. I don't want to rush this. The paper is really nice and wet. If you find your paper is drying out a bit, just give it a spray with a spritzer bottle of fine mist, and it should stop your painting from drying too quickly. I'm just painting this sort of yellow orange here now, a little bit more damp into wet. The paper's wet, so to make your brush damp, just take the excess paint off on a paper towel. With damp paint, which is different to wet paint moves quicker, spreads faster. Damp paint stays put, but you still get a soft edge. It doesn't travel so much. Just using some ultramarine here and pink, I'm taking the excess off on my paper towel, so my brush is damp, and I'm just dropping in this violet colour. So I am using the paper towel just to control the amount of paint on my brush, especially as I work towards the horizon here. Now, if you're worried about using a large brush, do swap to a smaller brush if you want to, if you're going to paint these smaller sort of shadow clouds in the distance here, which is quite nice, because sometimes the larger brushes do give off a lot of watery paint. So I'm just making sure I don't introduce too much moisture. So you want the consistency to be the same or not as wet, so damper than the actual surface of the paper, so the paint doesn't run too much into the other colours, which can actually muddy those colours. So using the paper towel, which is what you can see I'm doing here, it really does control the amount of paint so it doesn't spread, but you still got those lovely soft edges, painting damp into damp. The other thing I'm doing here is I am painting the clouds smaller as they go towards the horizon. They're a lot bigger at the top of the sky because that's the nearest part of the sky to us. Way off into the horizon, it's a lot further away. So we're creating the illusion of depth by creating and painting smaller shapes in the distance, creating the illusion of a 3D space on a 2D surface. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I'm just mixing up a puddle of ultramarine. It's quite dilute. It's going to be a very pale blue sky area. I'm using a large brush to wet the surface of the paper very gently. You could actually spritz this as well to wet the surface of the paper. Make sure your painting is dry. Make sure your brush is soft so it doesn't disturb the paint. And I'm going to now paint the blue sky in using my size 10 brush. I decided to add a little bit of cerulean in with the ultramarine, and I'm painting wet into wet. And just trying to leave a little gap between the yellow and the blue so it just avoids any green paint. So it might be tricky as it gets narrower, and you may want to swap to a smaller brush. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. And once your painting is dry, wet your sea area, and I've mixed up some ultramarine, a touch of pink and a touch of Payne's grey. So I'm just painting in the sea there using the size 10 brush, and just sort of nice horizontal marks, smaller ones in the distance, thinner lines, and bigger marks as the sea comes towards you in the foreground there. So it really creates depth in the painting, and just try to leave some gaps there in the sea. So when the painting is dry, I'm going to put some of the colour from the sky in the sea so it looks like some really colourful reflections. So I'm just mixing up some creamier, darker paint just to paint some darker marks in the sea, painting my own interpretation of the photograph, painting it in the foreground there, damp into damp, and then a few more little dark marks sort of in the centre of the sea. And as you can see, I've left a little bit of light there in the sea as well, which I'll put some colour in there later. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry and remove the masking fluid. And I'm using the size 2 brush, making sure it's absolutely clean. I'm just using some yellow, and I'm just painting around the sun with that yellow, wet on dry, with my size 2 brush, where I actually masked out this area previously with the masking fluid. And I'm painting this yellow in the reflections in the sea as well here, wet on dry. I'm adding a little bit of cadmium red to the yellow to make an orange, and I'm painting this damp into damp around the light of the sun to really bring out the sun there, to make it the focal point. Take your time when you're doing this. And I'm just blending now with a clean, damp brush. I'm just putting a little bit of yellow and white mixed together just on the water here. I just felt I needed a little bit more reflection of the sun in the sea there. So I've finished my second painting. I'm going to move on to my third painting. So for my third sky, I'm going to paint a sky at night. So I'm mixing up here some Prussian blue and some Prussian blue mixed with Payne's grey. That's for the very dark area of the sky there. Nice big puddles, so you don't have to mix again as you're painting your sky. I'm mixing up some quinacridone magenta, but any pink will do, and some Prussian blue. I'm wetting the paper here. Make sure again you take your time wetting the paper. I'm using a large mop brush. So really giving that a good soak, making sure all the areas are nice and wet. Again, I've used masking fluid to mask out the moon and the stars. I'm going to apply the sort of violet colour first, so the lightest colour first, around that sort of area in the sky, sort of top left, and around the moon as well. And I'm just applying now sort of a lighter, I've got the Prussian blue here, it's quite watery, so it's that quite lighter blue around the moon there as well, and just painting it around the violet. This is all wet into wet, and I'm using my size 10 brush. I'm quite excited about this sky. I'm just mixing a little bit more pink in there, making it a bit more creamy, and just painting a stronger sort of violet colour in there. It's a little bit of a darker shade in there as well, so nice and creamy. This is a little bit more damp into wet. And remember to keep getting fresh paint, that's really important. So I'm just working my way a little bit of Payne's grey now. You could use indigo, and you wouldn't even have to put the Prussian blue in there because it's almost like an indigo colour I've made here. And I'm painting it on the wet surface, still using that size 10 brush. So I'm sort of putting it all around the top area, down the left hand side, a little bit on the bottom right hand side of the sky there and across. I want to keep that lighter area here and there, so it's kind of like a focal point as well. I'm just putting a little bit more of the Payne's grey, a little bit of the Prussian blue here, painting damp into damp, and I'm mixing up a thicker Payne's grey and a touch of Prussian blue. I'm going to take the excess paint off on my paper towel so my brush is damp, the paper is damp, and I'm painting around the moon, damp into damp, because when I take the masking fluid off, that moon will really sort of glow with the dark paint around it. It'll kind of be my focal point as well. So just adding a few more darks, damp into damp here and there. And I'm going to allow the painting to dry. So I've wet the bottom part of the painting so the paper is damp. I am now using my plastic card. I've wet the bottom area of the paper here, and I'm just using a little bit of the Payne's Grey and Burnt Sienna and just sort of varying it. I've actually cut my card up quite skinny so I can dip it into the pans, which makes it so much easier to apply the paint. And I'm just painting this now sort of damp into damp, just creating all these buildings just by really just pulling the card down, going across, using the tip of the card as well to make it easier to paint complex buildings like this. So as you saw there, I've just mixed up a little bit of the Payne's Grey and a bit of the ultramarine, so it's a really dark colour. This bottom left hand corner is really dark, so I just wanted to put that in the painting there. So just again applying some more paint literally straight from the tube onto the damp surface, varying the sort of heights of the buildings using the side of the card, the tip of the card, and working my way along there. It's so much fun to do this and so effective. My one tip would be don't overwork it. Remember, in watercolour painting, less is more. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. And I'm removing the masking fluid from all of the paintings. Right, and I'm using some white gouache and I'm spattering a little bit more on this starry sky. If you haven't used masking fluid, you can now use some white gouache for the sky and the moon. If you don't have gouache, you could use white watercolour. It's not as opaque, or you could use acrylic as well. And I'm using the size 2 brush now just to put in some lights in the windows. Windows in my sort of buildings that I created with my plastic card, and I've actually used the gouache. I'm going to use some yellow paint as well, some yellow lights, and I think I'll use some red as well. Really will give a little bit of colour to this painting, make it a little bit more interesting as well. And you can use the paint straight from the tube, so it makes it more opaque and it stands out a lot better. And I'm using the size 2 brush again with the white gouache. I just felt my moon was a bit ragged on the edges there. So if you need just to tidy things up, it's quite useful for that. So I think I'll leave my nighttime painting there for now. I hope you enjoyed that one. My last short tutorial is of a stormy sky, and I'm going to do a 2-stage sky. Let's get started. So I'm using a little bit of yellow here and burnt sienna, and I'm actually painting this, wetting this stormy sky again. So lots of these skies wet in wet. This is going to be a 2-stage sky, as the one above it is as well. And I'm just applying the yellow onto the horizon. If you look at the reference photograph, there's a lot of kind of a yellowy horizon there. If you don't want to use this particular permanent yellow, you could use raw sienna for the horizon as well if you wanted to. So I'm just putting a little bit of that in the sea because I can see a little bit of yellow colour in the sea. And I'm just using quite a watered down burnt sienna just for a bit of warmth in those clouds. It'll give them a little bit of body and depth later on. So I'm putting all burnt sienna in there, painting all of this wet into wet. So I'm actually using a little bit of the violet now, that's the Prussian blue and the pink, and I'm painting that wet in wet just in the sea because I can see a little bit of purple in there as well, just using my imagination a little bit. This is ultramarine and I'm just adding a little bit of burnt sienna to it. Ultramarine and burnt sienna are a great combination. They make a really nice sort of blue-grey colour, or dark browns. You can really sort of vary it. So I've just got it quite watered down here, and I'm just painting some softer shadows around the horizon and just coming up into this sort of bottom part and middling part of the sky, putting in those really sort of smaller cloud shadows in the distance there. So if your brush is too wet, remember you can take the excess off on the paper towel as well, just painting those distant clouds damp into wet. And now I'm mixing up some ultramarine again with the burnt sienna, this time a little bit more paint, slightly creamier, damp into damp still, and just using the tip of the brush just to put a few more dark shadows on those clouds in the distance there. It really gives a little bit of depth to the painting. So just finishing off this first stage of the sky, I'm going to allow my painting to dry to paint the next stage. I'm Mixing up some really nice dark stormy colours here. I've used a bit of the Payne's grey, I'm using a bit of Prussian blue and ultramarine with a bit of burnt sienna, so you can really go to town. Make sure they're nice and creamy, because remember that surface here is wet. So I've got some Prussian blue there, a little bit more ultramarine here. I'm going to mix this with the burnt sienna. So I'm using a large soft haired brush and wetting the sky area. Just be very careful when you do this. Do it nice and slow so you don't wake up the washes underneath, because you can get back runs and muddiness. And I'm going to start working wet into wet. So I've just gone on there with a little bit of the Prussian blue. I think there's a tiny bit of burnt sienna in there as well. You could actually use some violet colours here as well, would be quite nice. It doesn't have to be exactly like the photograph, but I'm just working wet on wet here. Remember to leave gaps so you've got that light colour coming through as well, so that light sky behind, and still using the size 10 brush. And the other thing you can do as well, if you want to, is a little bit of tilting to get things going and moving. It's quite good fun. As you work towards the horizon, do leave lots more light, as it is in the photograph there. You need some light here. So as you can see here, I'm tilting, and I'll actually paint sideways as well here. So you could actually use a bit of the Payne's grey and a bit of burnt sienna for the warmth here, and just tickle in a little bit of dark clouds just here and there. And I'm going to use some of the colours that I use for the sky for the sea as well. This is actually wet on dry, so as you saw there, I pulled my brush very quickly where you get that lovely dry brush effect, and I'm just leaving some little gaps there as well for some light to come through, as you can see from the photograph as well. So I've got some Prussian blue, ultramarine and burnt sienna at the bottom there, and just some Payne's grey and a bit of Prussian blue at the top and at the bottom. So you're really varying the colours. There's lots of dark in that sea. As you get towards the foreground, they're very dark, and that's damp into damp. Just getting a touch more of the ultramarine and Payne's grey just to really get that dark in the foreground, and painting a little bit there in the centre of the sea. Some of my sea is running up into the sky, so if that's happening, just pick that up with the paper towel, dab that off. But actually it's almost looking a little bit like some land and trees in the distance, so I think I'll leave it. And as you saw there, I scraped out a little bit with my plastic card. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. And I thought this stormy sky painting needed a sailing boat. It's quite effective just to have some sort of focal point there. So I'm just using the gouache as well. But if you want to put a sailboat in your painting, maybe you could use the masking fluid at the beginning if you want to set that up. It just occurred to me towards the end there. So I'm just using the gouache and a little bit of dark just underneath the sail there. And I'll put a little bit of the white gouache in the water as well, so it looks like a reflection from the sail. A little bit of artistic license here, but it's very effective, and I thought I'd put the gouache in the sea as well to create more light. So I'm just mixing up a dark now, and I'm going to paint some birds in the sky wet on dry using my size 2 brush to finish off this last painting. So here are all the finished paintings. I really hope you enjoyed these 4 short tutorials, painting 4 different skies, keeping everything simple, painting from your imagination, using a plastic card, lots and lots of wet in wet techniques, etc. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to support the content that I publish here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You can get access to weekly exclusive tutorials, downloadable outline sketches, ad-free content, and you can cancel anytime. More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.